They said no one had ever hit him. The human landed 5 before he even realized the fight had begun. The first thing I noticed about Vorak 9 was his breathing. It was slow, controlled. The kind of breathing that belongs to a creature that has never once in its life felt the cold grip of doubt. He stood at the far end of the ceremonial hall, aboard the Galactic Council station known as Pillar Ven, and every alien in that enormous room was watching him the way people watch a mountain. Not with fear of what it might do, but with a quiet acknowledgement that it simply existed beyond their power to change. I was the only human in the room. My name is Nathan Cole, and I had been assigned as diplomatic aide to Ambassador Grace Ellison of the United Earth Delegation. I carried no weapon. I wore a gray dress uniform with a small Earth emblem on the left breast. I had a notepad in my jacket pocket and a stylus behind my ear. I looked, by every measure the aliens in that room could apply, like someone who had been sent to take notes and stay out of the way. That was fine with me. The hall was extraordinary in the way that only a place built to impress can be. The ceiling rose at least 40 meters above the polished floor, and the walls were lined with tall arched windows that looked out onto the black of deep space, broken only by the slow drift of distant stars. Hundreds of delegates from dozens of species filled the tiered seating around the central floor. Some were tall and thin as reeds. Some were broad and low to the ground, with thick armored hides that caught the hall's lighting and scattered it in dull angles. Some floated inside small pressure chambers, their environments too different from the shared atmosphere to permit direct contact. The room had been built for moments like this one. You could feel it in the proportions, the sightlines, the way the seating curved inward to ensure that everyone had a clear view of the floor below. All of them were watching Vorak 9. He was Cathari. That meant something in this part of the galaxy. The Cathari had been the dominant military species in the known cluster for over 3 centuries. They were tall. Vorak 9 stood close to 11 feet, with 2 sets of arms, a body structure that was dense with interlocking muscle, and a skull that sloped back from a low, wide brow in a shape that had been specifically evolved to absorb impact. Their skin was a deep gray blue, almost like the color of a storm cloud just before rain begins. Their eyes were amber and large, capable of tracking movement at speeds that most species could not register. They were not the largest species in the Galactic Council. They were not, by certain technical measures, the physically strongest, but they were the most practiced at the application of what they had, and they had never, in 300 years of formal interspecies relations, encountered a moment that required them to practice harder. Vorak 9 was not just Cathari. He was the Cathari champion. The word they used for him in their own language translated loosely as the Unbroken One. He had stood in formal combat 312 times, across 14 species, on 9 different stations and planets spread across this corner of the galaxy. He had never once been defeated. More than that, and this was the detail that everyone in the room knew, the detail that hung in the air like wood smoke in still weather. He had never once been struck. Not a single blow from any species had ever landed on him. Every opponent had either surrendered before the fight truly began, or had been put down so quickly that they had no time to raise a hand in their own defense. He was, in the polished language of the Galactic Council, an instrument of resolution. When a dispute between species required a show of force, when a delegation needed to be reminded of its place in the established order, Vorak 9 was sent. He was the reminder. He had been the reminder for a very long time, and he had never needed to do much more than arrive. He had been sent for us. Ambassador Grace Ellison was standing 3 feet to my left, and I could feel the tension in her without looking directly at her. She was a brilliant woman, calm under pressure, precise in her words, a 20-year career diplomat who had negotiated trade agreements with 6 non-human species and had brought 3 separate interspecies disputes to resolution through patience and language alone. But she had not been trained for this. Nobody in the Earth delegation had been trained for this, because nobody had expected that Councillor Drath of the Cathari bloc would manufacture a breach of protocol so thin and so obvious that even the junior aide taking notes could see it for what it was. It had started 3 hours earlier, during the afternoon session of what was supposed to be a routine summit on cargo lane access rights in the outer sectors. A straightforward matter. Dull, even by the standards of interspecies diplomacy. Ambassador Ellison had submitted a revised proposal on behalf of Earth, standard language, pre-cleared with 3 of the 4 voting blocks, no surprises and no hidden provisions. Councillor Drath had stood and declared that the proposal contained a cartographic reference that encroached on Cathari sovereign space by 0.003 light seconds. It was a number so small it was essentially without meaning. The galaxy was not mapped to that level of precision on a good day, and the outer sector charts that everyone in the room was working from were accurate, to within a margin 10 times larger than the alleged encroachment. But Drath had spoken the words with the gravity of someone announcing a declaration of conflict, and now, 3 hours later, the afternoon agenda had been cleared, the hall had been prepared, and Vorak 9 had walked through the tall doors at the far end of the room. Vorak 9 walked forward. He did not walk fast, he did not need to. Every step he took sent a low vibration through the polished floor that I could feel through the soles of my shoes. He was wearing ceremonial armor, plates of dark material that covered his chest and shoulders and upper arms, with joints of woven cord at the elbows and knees. His 4 hands were uncovered. They were the size of serving platters. He held them loose at his sides, easy and relaxed, the way a craftsman holds their hands when walking to a job they have done 1,000 times. Around the hall, I saw alien delegates shifting in their seats. Some were leaning forward with what I recognized as anticipation, the forward tilt of a body expecting a spectacle. Others had turned their eyes slightly away, in the way you look away from something you know will be unpleasant to witness. A few of the smaller species pressed back in their seating, as if some ancient part of their biology was urging them to increase the distance between themselves and Vorak 9, even though they were already 30 meters above the floor. A translator unit hovered near the ceiling and emitted a tone indicating that formal proceedings were about to be spoken. Drath's voice came from the speaker array. He was not in the room himself. He was watching from a sealed observation balcony high above, which told you everything you needed to know about how much personal risk he considered appropriate. The Cathari sovereignty formally requests the presence of the human representative in resolution of the registered breach, Drath said through the translator. Under Article 9 of the Pillar Accord, the matter will be resolved by demonstration. Demonstration. That was the word they used for it. 300 years of galactic politics had smoothed and polished it into something that sounded almost administrative, almost procedural, like a line item on an agenda. But there was nothing administrative about Vorak 9 standing 30 feet away from me on a polished floor while 400 alien observers watched in silence from their seats. There was nothing procedural about what was being arranged. They wanted me to walk out onto that floor and be put down in front of everyone here, and the message would travel outward from Pillar Ven faster than any trade document. This is what humanity is. This is where they belong in the order of things. Ambassador Ellison stepped forward slightly, and I stepped forward with her. Nathan, she said quietly, not looking at me. Her voice was carefully controlled, but I knew her well enough to hear what was underneath the control. You do not have to. It is fine, I said. She turned her head just slightly. He has never… I know, I said. I read the file. She looked at me for a moment. I could not read exactly what was in her eyes. It might have been concern. It might have been something close to apology. The kind that comes when a situation has moved past the point where anyone can fix it with words. It might have been something else entirely. Grace Ellison was a woman who felt things deeply and showed them sparingly, and I had learned not to assume I could always read the difference. I handed her my notepad and the stylus from behind my ear. Then I took 3 steps forward, onto the open floor, and I stood there in my gray uniform under the light of 1,000 distant suns, facing the most decorated fighter in the known galaxy. The hall went very quiet. Vorak 9 looked at me the way you might look at something you found unexpectedly on the floor of your transport. Not with hostility, exactly, but with a kind of puzzled indifference. He tilted his great head slightly to one side. His amber eyes moved over me from feet to face, measuring, cataloging, and then I saw it, small but unmistakable, dismissing. Whatever algorithm his mind was running to assess threat level had returned a low number, and his body had already begun to move forward on the assumption that this would be over before it really began. He opened his lower set of arms in the formal Cathari gesture that preceded a resolution challenge. The translator unit hovered closer to catch the initiation phrase. He began to draw breath to speak the words, and I was already moving, not fast by the standards of what I am about to tell you. But I was moving before he had any reason to expect movement, before the room had any reason to expect movement, and in a fight, in any fight between any creatures, anywhere in the known universe, the one who decides first is the one who defines everything that comes after. I had spent 11 years learning how to decide first. The hall did not have time to react. One moment I was standing 12 feet away from him in my gray jacket with my hands at my sides. The next I was close. Very close, and then 5 things happened in a sequence so rapid that most of the observers in that hall would later describe the entire event as a single indistinguishable blur of motion. They would say it happened so fast that they were not sure what they had witnessed until the outcome was already settled. The first blow landed before Vorak 9 had finished opening his arms. He went down on one knee before the second word of his challenge had left his throat. By the time the translator unit had processed that something had gone very differently from what was expected, it was over. The hall was absolutely silent. I stepped back. I straightened my jacket. I looked down at the unbroken one, kneeling on the floor of the ceremonial hall of Pillar Ven, and then I looked up at the 400 delegates watching from their seats in tiered rows above me. Not one of them made a sound. From somewhere high above, in the sealed observation balcony, I heard something that might have been Counselor Drath setting down his glass, or possibly dropping it. I turned around and walked back to Ambassador Ellison. She was staring at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before and was not sure I could name. I reached out, and she handed me my notepad without saying a word. I clicked the stylus and wrote at the top of a fresh page, "Summit, complications pending, will advise." Then I stood beside her, facing the hall, and waited for someone in the room to decide what happened next. The 5 strikes took me less than 2 seconds to deliver. That sounds like something a person says to make themselves sound impressive at a dinner table. And I want to be clear that I am not telling you this for that reason. I am telling you because the length of time matters. It matters because Vorak 9 was not slow. He was not unprepared. He was not caught off guard in the way that a person who has never faced a threatening situation might be caught off guard. He was a trained, decorated, 312-fight veteran of formal combat, with 4 arms, a body built like a structure designed to hold weight under pressure, and a brain that had spent its entire adult life in situations exactly like this one. He had seen more resolution floors than most species would see in a century of diplomatic engagement. He simply had never been in a situation where the other person had already begun before the situation officially started. That is the thing about how I was trained. The instructors at the Earth Diplomatic Security Division did not teach you to wait for an attack to arrive and then respond to it. They did not teach you to meet force with equal force at the moment of contact. They taught you to read the geometry of a situation, the angle of someone's shoulders, the distribution of weight across their feet, the micro-adjustments their center of balance was making before their conscious mind had committed to any particular action, and to respond to what you read before the other person had finished translating their intention into movement. It is not a trick. It is not cunning, exactly. It is a discipline, and it takes years to build, and it is never fully finished building. You learn it layer by layer, the way you learn any skill that lives in the body rather than in the mind, and each layer only reveals the next one once the one beneath it is solid. My name is Nathan Cole. I am 34 years old. I grew up in a small city in northern England called Carlisle, close to the Scottish border, in a place where it rained approximately 300 days a year, and the hills on the horizon were always the same green-gray, whether it was summer or winter. The main things to do were read, argue about things you had read, and train at the boxing club on the east side of town. My father took me to that club on a Wednesday evening when I was 9 years old. He had grown up going there himself and thought it would be good for me, which was something fathers said about boxing clubs that was sometimes true and sometimes aspirational. In my case, it turned out to be simply true. I punched a heavy bag for 40 minutes that first evening and came home with sore hands and a feelings in my chest that I could not name at the time, but that I now understand was purpose. Not because I was good at it, I was not, yet, but because there was something in the discipline of it that matched something in me in a way that nothing else had managed to do. The bag did not care how I felt about it. It did not respond to cleverness or to talking. It responded only to what I actually did, and what I actually did was either correct or it was not. And the bag told me which one it was with a clarity that nothing in school or at home had ever matched. I boxed through secondary school. I added wrestling at university when I discovered that grappling used a different set of muscles and a different kind of spatial thinking, and that the combination of the two produced something more complete than either alone. After university, I spent 2 years with a private protective services firm before the Earth Diplomatic Security Division recruited me at 23. I have been doing this work for 11 years now. I am not the strongest person I have ever trained with. I am not the fastest. But I am very good at the moment before a fight begins, because that moment, the drawn breath, the suspended instant where everything is still possible, is where all fights are actually decided, regardless of what happens after. When I stepped forward onto the floor of that ceremonial hall, and Vorak 9 began to open his lower arms in the formal gesture of challenge. I was not thinking about how large he was. I was thinking about geometry. Specifically, I was thinking about his geometry, and about where the opening was, and about the sequence that would take me through that opening and to the conclusion in the minimum number of moves. His center of gravity was high, very high, because of how his spine curved forward under the weight of his upper body and the broad plating of his chest armor. A high center of gravity is not inherently a weakness. It depends on the base. Vorak 9's base was wide, which gave him stability on the horizontal plane, but the steepness of the angle from his center of gravity to his feet meant that any disruption of either his balance or the structural integrity of the joints that maintained it would translate upward through his entire frame. You did not need to knock something this large sideways. You needed to compromise the load-bearing elements. I had read the xenobiology file the night before. Ambassador Ellison had compiled it with the help of the station's scientific archive, a careful document full of anatomical diagrams, measured illustrations, and clinical notes about Cathari physiology written in the precise, detached language of species that study each other for professional purposes. I had read it twice before sleeping, and once more at 5 in the morning when sleep had become unlikely, and lying in the bunk of a space station at 5 in the morning looking at the ceiling is the best possible condition for memorizing anatomical information, because there is nothing else competing for your attention. I knew the file. I covered the 12 feet between us in 4 steps, angling slightly to his right to bring myself inside the natural reach of his dominant upper arms, the pair that were longer and more heavily muscled, the ones that would have been most dangerous to me if he had completed the motion he was beginning. The first strike was a sharp, compact jab to the nerve cluster at the base of his throat, not the throat itself, but the dense bundle of peripheral signal tissue that sits just below the windpipe in Cathari anatomy. The file had described it in careful clinical language as a concentration of neural pathways responsible for the coordination of voluntary upper limb movement. A sharp, precisely aimed impact there does not cause lasting damage. What it does is interrupt the body's ability to issue reliable voluntary commands to the arms for approximately 1.2 seconds. That is not a long time. In a conversation, 1.2 seconds is a pause. In a fight, it is more than enough. His lower arms dropped involuntarily. I was already moving toward the second point of contact before they hit his sides. The second strike was a palm heel to the hinge joint of his jaw, the wide, flat articulation on the right side of his face where the upper and lower skull plates connect. In a Cathari, this joint sits very close to the surface of the skin, protected by much less material than the heavily armored forehead or the reinforced brow ridge. I hit it with the heel of my right hand, compact and precisely aimed, using the force that comes from the hips rotating into the strike rather than the arm alone. His head snapped to the left. The third strike was my left elbow, coming back across in the same motion as my head tracked right, catching him along the sensory ridge that runs above the right ear in Cathari anatomy. The sensory ridge is not a weapon. It is a sensory organ. It reads vibrations and pressure differentials in the surrounding environment and feeds that information to the brain continuously, providing a form of spatial awareness that gives the Cathari their remarkable ability to track multiple threats simultaneously. Striking it does not destroy it. What it does is flood it with false input, producing a burst of overwhelming signal noise that the brain interprets as incoming stimulus from many directions at once. For approximately 2 seconds, the Cathari fighter experiences something very close to the disorientation of being in a room where every surface has suddenly moved without warning. His weight shifted backward and to the right. The fourth strike was a knee, driving upward and forward into the tibial joint of his right leg. The forward angled joint that sits approximately midway down a Cathari leg, the point where the force of standing and moving is managed and distributed across the lower limb. A sharp upward impact at the correct angle introduces force at a vector the joint was not designed to receive. It does not break, but it bends, briefly and involuntarily, in a direction that the supporting musculature was not ready for. He went down on one knee. The fifth strike was a hammer fist, the padded lower edge of my right hand, drawn tight and driven downward onto the base of his skull at the junction where the cervical ridge meets the upper spine. I did not use full force. Full force at that location applied correctly causes injury, and injuring him was not the purpose of what I was doing. The purpose was conclusion. When the 4 preceding strikes have already removed a fighter's balance, their postural stability, their spatial orientation, their joint function, and flooded their sensory system with noise, you do not need to cause harm to end the engagement. You need only to be done, and to make the being you are facing understand that you are done, and that the choice of whether to continue belongs entirely to them. He was on his knee with his head lowered and his forearms braced against the floor before I stepped back. I straightened my jacket. I let the moment settle for exactly as long as it needed to settle. The hall was silent. I want to try to describe that silence accurately, because I have spent 11 years working in difficult rooms across 2 planets and 1 space station, and I have never been in a silence quite like that one. It was not the silence that follows a loud noise, where the absence of sound is itself a kind of ringing. It was not the silence of confusion, where people are looking at each other to verify that they all witnessed the same event. It was something more specific than either of those. It was the silence that descends when a room full of intelligent beings who have built civilizations and written philosophies and studied the mechanics of power for centuries, all arrive at the same revised understanding at exactly the same moment. The understanding was this: the measurement they had been using was wrong. Not wrong about Vorak 9 specifically. Not wrong about the Cathari specifically. Wrong in a more fundamental way. Wrong about the metric itself. They had looked at humanity and assessed us by the categories that made sense to them: height, physical mass, biological durability, response speed at the cellular level. By those measures we came up short against most species in this room. We were small. We were soft by the standards of armored beings. We lived short lives compared to half the species represented at this summit. We were, in the official records of the Galactic Registry, a Class C species, non-threatening, moderate intelligence, high emotional variability, strategic value pending further assessment. Class C. I stood on that floor, and I could feel all of that reclassification happening in real time around me. It moved through the room the way temperature moves through still water. Not all at once, not evenly, but spreading outward from a point, reaching every corner, changing the character of everything it passed through. I could see it in small, individual moments scattered across the tiers of seating. A delegate who had been leaning back in their seat was now sitting straight. Another whose eyes had been fixed on Vorak 9 in anticipation now had their gaze directed at me, and the quality of that gaze had changed from the speculative interest you point at a spectacle to the careful, focused attention you give something you need to understand better. In the tiered seats to my left, a young delegate from a species called the Veth, long and blue-gray and naturally still, sat forward in their chair. It was a small movement, barely visible from the floor. But it was the only movement in a room where nobody else was moving at all, and I noticed it with the part of my brain that notices things like that during moments when the larger part is occupied elsewhere. They sat forward, and their large pale eyes were fixed on me, and the expression on their face was one I recognized from classrooms and training halls and any room where someone has just had the foundational assumption of an exercise corrected. The expression of someone who understands that they need to start again from the beginning, with new information, and who is not unhappy about it. I turned around and walked back to Ambassador Grace Ellison. She was holding my notepad. She handed it to me when I reached her, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The room behind me was still silent. Vorak 9 was still down, and I did not look back at him. The hall needed time to process what it had seen, and the worst thing I could do in that moment was give it something new to focus on. Then Ellison said very quietly, "How many years?" I said. She nodded once, slowly. "I will need to put something in the report." "I know. The council will want a formal statement." "Yes. You understand this changes every dynamic in this room." "I know that too," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she turned back to face the hall, and her expression settled into the calm, composed look that she wore in difficult rooms as naturally as other people wore clothes. "For what it is worth," she said, almost too quiet for anyone else to hear, "I am very glad you were standing beside me." I did not say anything to that. I clicked my stylus and looked down at my notepad, but I will tell you honestly, I was glad to be standing beside her too. Across the hall, Vorak 9 was being helped to his feet by 2 members of the Kethyari delegation, who had come quickly and quietly down from the upper tier. He was upright. He was not seriously injured. I had been careful about that, more careful than the situation strictly required, because I had decided before I moved that the outcome I needed was not injury. He stood with his head slightly lowered and his forehands still, and the great amber eyes that had looked at me with dismissal, 20 minutes ago, were now looking at nothing in particular. He was in a state I recognized from my own training, the state of a fighter whose internal map of the world has just been revised without warning, who has not yet built the new map and is navigating in the gap between the two. He had believed one thing about himself for 312 engagements. He now had to decide what he believed instead. I understood that state from the inside. I had been there twice in my own life, once at 17, on the floor of the boxing club in Carlisle, with the fluorescent light overhead flickering and the room tilting around me, and once at 26, in a training exercise that had gone wrong in 3 separate ways in less than 4 seconds. Both times, the getting back up had required something that was not exactly courage, not exactly stubbornness, but was some particular and unnamed combination of the two that lives below both of those words. I hoped he had whatever that thing was called. Around the hall, the silence was gradually breaking apart into small sounds, the murmur of voices beginning in the upper tiers, the low hum of translation units catching up to conversations that had started in their absence. The room was doing what rooms full of political beings always do when something unexpected has occurred. It was finding a new story to tell about what had just happened, and deciding which version of that story served the most interests. I did not know what story they would choose. That was not my decision to make. My decision had been made 12 feet from the greatest fighter in the known galaxy, and it had been made in the space of a breath. Before the moment officially began, I had decided to start. That was the whole of it, not strength, not size, not any advantage in speed or armor or biological durability. I had simply decided to start, while everyone else in that room was still waiting to see what would happen next. 312 fights, and in every one of them, nobody had ever decided to start. I stood beside Ambassador Ellison with my notepad in my hand, and the stars moved very slowly outside the tall, arched windows, and somewhere in the sealed observation balcony high above us, I heard the particular silence of a man who had no words for what he had just seen, struggling to find some. I was not thinking about Counselor Drath. I was thinking about a boxing club on the east side of Carlisle, and a Wednesday evening, and sore hands, and a feeling in my chest at 9 years old that I had not known how to name. I knew how to name it now. The next morning, the council did not open the main session on schedule. I found out about the delay through the translated station announcements that played at low volume in the corridor outside the delegation's quarters, and through a short message from the council secretariat delivered to Ambassador Ellison's device at 6 in the morning. The message said, in the characteristically circular language of interspecies diplomatic correspondence, a recess of procedural review has been called to ensure the correct conditions for continued dialogue are established prior to resumption of scheduled proceedings. What that meant in plain words was that nobody in the council was sure what to do yet. Ambassador Ellison and I sat at the small table in the delegation's common room, with 2 cups of something the station's catering system described as a hot beverage analogous to coffee. It tasted like coffee that had been described to someone over a weak signal and then recreated from incomplete notes, recognizable in outline, slightly wrong in every specific. It was not bad, it was just off in the small, consistent way that reminded you quietly of how far you were from home, the way that most things on a space station did when you paid attention to them. Ellison had her hands around her cup and was looking at the wall with the focused, slightly internal expression she wore. When she was running calculations she had not finished. The formal complaint from the Cathari block was transmitted at 3 this morning, she said. How many counts? I asked. 7. She paused. 6 of them involve procedural irregularities in their own initiation of the resolution challenge. They appear to have realized, somewhere in the hours between yesterday afternoon and 3 in the morning, that they constructed a mechanism they did not fully control. And the 7th, unprovoked physical engagement by a human representative in contravention of diplomatic conduct standards. She set her cup down with the slight, deliberate care she used when managing something she found irritating, which would carry weight if Vorak 9 had not been formally dispatched to the floor under Article 9 of the Pillar Accord. So they started a process that protects the person who finished it. I said yes. She almost smiled. They are very unhappy about that. I drank my not-quite coffee and considered it. The truth was, I had not thought far past the moment on the floor. That is the nature of the training. The training handles the moment. You handle everything that comes after. There are 3 informal meeting requests as well, Ellison said, pulling up her device. From the Veth Collective, the Marin Assembly, and from something called the Outer Rim Secondary Council, which I am told represents 11 species with observer status at the summit. I looked at her. They want to meet with us. With the human delegation, yes. She looked up from the device, not about cargo lanes. I nodded slowly. I had a feeling I understood what those meetings were going to be about, and it was not the kind of thing that could be addressed in the remaining days of this summit. It was the kind of thing that would take years and many smaller conversations in rooms much quieter than the ceremonial hall. Before I could say anything further, there was a knock at the door of the common room. Neither of us had been expecting anyone. Ellison and I exchanged a brief look, and then I stood up and went to the door. Standing in the corridor was a Cathari, not Vorak 9. This one was younger, or at least less weathered by years in the field, and was wearing the gray administrative robe of a council aide rather than armor. He was taller than me by 4 feet and was looking at a point slightly to the left of my face, which I had learned from the xenobiology file indicated, in Cathari social convention, that he was making a request rather than any kind of challenge. "I have a message," he said through the translation device at his collar, "for the human who stood on the floor." "That is me," I said. He extended one of his lower hands and held out a small flat data chip, the kind used for secure private transmission between parties who did not want their communication routed through the station's open translation network. I took it. "From whom?" I asked. He looked at the point to the left of my face. "From him," he said. Then he turned and walked back down the corridor without another word. I closed the door and stood there for a moment looking at the chip in my palm. It was very small. It was also, in the way that small things sometimes are, considerably heavy. I went back to the table and set it in front of Ellison. She looked at it, then she looked at me. "From Vorak 9, she asked. "That would be my guess," I said. "You could choose not to open it," she said. "Yes," I agreed. She waited. I picked it up and pressed it against the reader on my device. The message that appeared was short. The translator had flagged it as an inexact rendering because several of the words used had no direct equivalents in standard Galactic Common. The closest the system could offer was this: "You stopped when you could have continued. I want to understand what kind of thing you are." I read it twice. Then I set the device down. "He thinks I showed restraint," I said. "You did show restraint," Ellison said. "I know. I just mean he noticed. He is thinking about why." I looked at the message again. "That is not a question someone asks out of anger. That is a question someone asks because they have encountered something that does not fit into the categories they have been using." Ellison was quiet for a moment. The imperfect coffee steamed gently between us. Outside the small porthole window, the stars were very still. "He has never lost before," she said. "No. So this is the first time in his life that question has been available to him." "Yes," I said. She picked up her cup. "What are you going to tell him?" I thought about the various answers. The strategic answer, the diplomatic answer, the answer that would be easiest to include in a report and explain in a debrief. Then I set all of those aside and thought about what was simply true. "I will tell him what actually happened," I said. I stopped because hurting him was never the purpose. The purpose was to answer a question the room had been carrying about us for a very long time. And what was the question? "Whether we could," I said. She looked at me over her cup. "And now they know we can." "Now they know we can," I said. "Which is different from knowing we will. And that difference is everything, going forward." She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was thinking in the particular working way she had. Not empty silence, but full silence. Occupied with the kind of processing that happens in a mind that has spent 30 years learning to read rooms and the people in them. "I need you to do something for me today," she said. "What?" "Come to the formal review session this afternoon and sit beside me and say almost nothing." I looked at her. "Almost?" "Almost." A small smile crossed her face. "I will tell you when the almost becomes necessary." The formal review session was held not in the great ceremonial hall, but in a smaller conference room on the station's 3rd tier. The ceiling was lower. The seating was arranged in a rectangle, which mattered more than it might seem to people who have not spent time in diplomatic rooms. When people sit in a circle, everyone faces a shared center. When they sit in a rectangle, they face each other across a narrow width of table. And that proximity changes what they are willing to say, and how willing they are to maintain positions under direct gaze. There were 14 delegates at the table. Ellison and I sat on one side. The Cathari delegation sat opposite. 4 of them, with Councillor Drath at the center of their line. He was smaller in person than the observation balcony had made him appear. Compact, dark-robed, with a face that showed no expression, which in my experience indicates that a considerable amount of it is being managed very carefully. The review opened with the formal reading of the complaint. 16 minutes of translated bureaucratic language. I sat and listened and made notes. Ellison sat with her hands flat on the table, and her face completely composed. When the reading finished, Drath spoke. "The conduct of the human representative represents a fundamental breach of the established spirit of resolution proceedings under the Pillar Accord," he said, through the translation system. "The Accord anticipates formal demonstration, but does not anticipate physical engagement before the initiation phrase has been completed and received. He allowed that to sit in the room. Ellison let it settle for exactly 2 seconds before she replied. With respect to Counselor Drath, she said, in the measured tone I had heard her use across more negotiations than I could count, the accord under Article 9 permits either party to engage at the point when floor presence has been established by both parties. The human representative was on the floor. The Cathari representative was on the floor. Article 9 was in full effect. No subclause in the accord requires one party to wait for the other to complete a verbal preamble before the resolution may proceed. A short silence. The precedent, Drag. The precedent, Ellison said, still very calm, is what has happened before. It is not the same thing as what the accord requires. Our representative followed the accord. The fact that no one has followed it in this particular way before does not constitute a violation. It constitutes a new precedent. Around the table I heard the soft sounds of translation units processing the exchange. The Veth delegate, Eason, I would learn her name later, sat very still and watched. Something behind Drath's eyes shifted in the way that things shift when a person realizes the argument they prepared will not hold the weight they expected it to. The human delegation, he said, more slowly now, seems to have prepared very carefully for an incident it claims was not anticipated. My aide is a careful person, Ellison said simply. Drath looked at me. I looked back at him. He looked away first. I wrote it down. The review ran for 3 hours. Ellison was exceptional throughout. She conceded several minor technical points with clean, unhesitating grace, which cost the delegation nothing, and gave her 2 genuine concessions from the Cathari bloc in exchange. Because people who have just watched someone concede gracefully are briefly more generous than they intended to be. By the end of the session, the formal complaint had been reduced to a single recorded notation with no binding consequence, and the cargo lane proposal had been reinstated to the following afternoon's agenda. But I want to tell you about one thing that happened inside that 3 hours that did not make it into the formal record. About 90 minutes in, one of the observer delegates, a Marin representative I did not know by name, a being with a wide flat face and eyes set very far apart on either side of a low skull, asked a question that was directed neither at the Cathari bloc nor at Ellison but at me specifically. They said through the translation system, the human representative was aware, at the time of the engagement, that no member of any species had previously initiated a physical response to a Cathari resolution challenge. Yes, I said, and the human representative proceeded with initiation regardless. Yes, I said. A pause. I thought about it. The room was very still. 14 delegates waiting. Ellison very carefully not looking at me. Because the question being asked about us deserved a real answer, I said. And the only real answer was the one that could only be given by someone who was not willing to wait for permission. The Marin delegate looked at me for a moment. Then they looked down at their notes and wrote something and did not ask another question. I did not know what they had written. I was not sure it mattered. The answer had been given and it was in the room. There was something in Drath's face during that exchange that I kept returning to afterward. Not the expression that was there. I have already said he showed no expression, but the quality of the blankness. There is a kind of blankness that comes from not feeling much, and a kind of blankness that comes from feeling a great deal and giving none of it a face. Drath's was the second kind. I had been reading faces in difficult rooms for 11 years, and I had become reasonably accurate at distinguishing the two. Whatever Drath was managing behind that flat, controlled exterior, it was not nothing, whether it was anger specifically, or the particular complicated emotion that belongs to a person who has constructed a trap and then discovered they are inside it. I could not say with precision, but it was substantial, and it was being held in very carefully. The Cathari delegation as a whole had become very still after Ellison's second major response. There are meetings where the energy in the room is expansive, where each exchange opens new territory, where the conversation grows. And there are meetings where the energy contracts, where each exchange reduces what was claimed, where the room gets smaller around one party and stays the same size around the other. This was the second kind of meeting, and it was the Cathari side of the table around which the room was contracting. I watched it happen with the detached, careful attention that Ellison had taught me to bring to rooms like this one, not with satisfaction, because satisfaction in a room like that one is a distraction and a liability, but with clarity. I was seeing what was happening accurately, and accuracy was the job. After the session ended and we had the corridor to ourselves, Ellison did something she almost never did. She let out a long, slow breath. Not a sigh, Just an exhale, the kind that comes from holding something carefully for a long time and then setting it down. The Marin delegate wrote something in their notes when you answered that question, she said. I know, I said. Do you know what they wrote? No, I said. But I think it will turn up eventually. She nodded. Yes, she said. It will. That was the almost. I had not needed Ellison to tell me when. We walked into the corridor, and I matched her pace, and neither of us spoke for a measured 30 seconds. Then she said, the almost. I noticed the moment, I said, when Drath made the remark about careful preparation. Yes, you said nothing. You had it, I said. And you were better than what I would have said. She looked at me sideways. You are a strange person, Nathan Cole. I have heard that before, I said. We reached the junction where our corridors branched. She paused. 3 more days, she said. And then home. Yes, I said. She turned down her corridor. I stood in the junction with my notepad under my arm and listened to the hum of recycled air in the station walls for a moment. I thought about the Marin delegate writing something in their notes and not asking another question. I thought about Drath looking away from me first, and what that would mean for the conversations he was going to have with his own delegation before the end of the day. I thought about the fact that 3 hours in a conference room had done what 300 years of quiet deference had not been able to do. It had produced a complaint so weak it could not stand on its own, from a block that it expected to be on solid ground. Ellison had seen the weakness and used it. That was not luck. That was 30 years of reading rooms and the people in them. Then I took out my device and wrote a reply to Vorak 9. I wrote simply and without calculation. I told him that I stopped when I did, because hurting him had never been the purpose. I told him the purpose was to answer a question, and that once a question is genuinely answered, anything further belongs to a different question entirely. I told him I did not see him as the enemy. I saw him as the instrument of a situation that had been constructed by people who were not him, and that there was a meaningful difference between the two. I sent it. Then I went to bed and lay there for a long time, looking at the ceiling of a room built for a species that was not mine, and thought about all of the things that were going to need to happen next, and about all the rooms in which they would need to happen, and about all the people who would sit in those rooms with new information that they had not had before this week began. There is something that happens to a mind when a belief it has held for a very long time is suddenly no longer true. It does not simply remove the old belief and replace it cleanly with a new one. The process is more complicated and more interesting than that. The mind goes through a period that is something like navigating with a map that no longer matches the territory. The roads are there in the map. You can see them. You can trace the route. But when you look up from the map and out at the actual ground, the roads do not go where they are supposed to go. The landmarks are in the wrong places. The distances are wrong. And you cannot simply draw a new map all at once. You draw it piece by piece, updating each section only after you have walked that section yourself and confirmed what is actually there. I am telling you this because over the 3 days that followed the afternoon on the ceremonial floor, I watched this process happen to an entire station, not just to Vorak 9, not just to the Ketheri delegation, to all of them. To every species on Pillar Ven who had been carrying a picture of humanity in their minds that the afternoon had made obsolete. It was visible in small ways if you knew what to look for, in the way conversations changed direction in the corridors, in the way delegates who had ignored the human delegation entirely for the first day of the summit now tracked us across rooms with a different quality of attention. I met with the Veth delegate on the morning of the second day. Her name, as near as the translation system could render it in a form my mouth could approximate, was something like Eason. She was tall and narrow-shouldered, with long expressive fingers and eyes that were pale and very wide, and she moved in the way that suggested her species had evolved in an environment where stillness was survival. Precise, minimal gestures, nothing unnecessary. She was, I learned from Ellison's briefing notes, primarily a researcher. Her title within the Veth Collective was something that translated roughly as the study of becoming, the academic field, concerned with how species develop and change as they encounter other forms of intelligence. She'd been assigned to the Galactic Registry's human file 14 years earlier, when Earth's first long-range vessels had crossed the outer marker. She had asked specifically to meet with me, not with Ellison. We sat in a small observation lounge on the 5th tier of the station, with a curved wall of transparent material looking out at the stars. A junior Veth aide sat to her right and managed the translation equipment. The translation was smooth and fast, which told me they had done this kind of cross-species conversation many times. I want to be direct with you, Eason said, after the brief exchange of formal greeting protocols that interspecies meetings required. I find indirect communication inefficient and frequently inaccurate. May I be direct? Please, I said. I have been studying your species for 14 years, she said. I have read every report filed by every observer species that has had contact with humans in the past 4 decades. I have analyzed behavioral patterns, physiological assessments, social structure analyses, and approximately 9,000 hours of media transmitted outward from Earth on open frequencies over the last century. She paused. All of it, compiled and considered together, produced an accurate but incomplete picture of what humanity is. What I observed 2 days ago has completed a section of that picture that I did not previously know was incomplete. What section? I asked. She considered the question with the care she appeared to bring to everything. Most intelligent species, when placed in a situation of direct physical threat in a public context, respond in one of 2 ways, she said. They reduce. They make themselves appear smaller, less threatening. They concede the power dynamic. They withdraw from the confrontation either physically or symbolically. Or they escalate. They make themselves appear larger. They project threat. They perform strength in front of the available audience. The performance is directed at the audience as much as at the source of the threat. The goal is to change the audience's perception of the balance of power, whether or not the actual balance changes. She tilted her head slightly. You did neither of those things. No, I said. You simply acted, she said, without performance, without escalation signals. You did not attempt to appear more capable than you were. You did not attempt to appear less capable than you were, either, which species sometimes do strategically. You assessed the available information, and you responded to it with the greatest efficiency the available time allowed, and then you walked back to your position and asked if the meal service had resumed. She looked at me steadily. That behavior pattern does not exist in our behavioral models for your species. What did the models predict? I asked. Withdrawal, she said, without hesitation. High probability of verbal protest followed by formal complaint lodged through diplomatic channels at a later stage. Some possibility of physical resistance that would be brief and unsuccessful. A short pause. Not this, I agreed. The absence of performance is the element I have been most focused on, she said. Every other species we have studied, when threatened publicly, performs for the observers present. The performance and the response become intertwined. The threat is not merely addressed. It is addressed in a way that communicates a secondary message to the audience, independently of the outcome itself. The secondary message is always about relative standing. I am more than you thought, or I am less than this situation requires. Some version of the calibration statement. She looked at me carefully. You made no calibration statement. You resolved the situation and returned to your seat. Where I grew up, I said, choosing my words slowly. There was a way of thinking about difficult moments that was not a formal philosophy. Not written down anywhere. Just something that lived in the culture of the place and the people there. The idea was that the way you carried yourself when things were hard told more about you than any other thing. Not whether the outcome went in your favor. How you moved through the difficulty. How you were when it was over. I paused. The performance is for the audience. Sitting back down is for yourself. Eason was quiet for a moment that I recognized as genuine processing rather than social pause. I would like to include this conversation in my ongoing research, she said. With your permission. You have it, I said. We talked for another full hour. She asked careful, methodical questions about decision-making in high-pressure physical situations, about the relationship between training and instinct, about what the concept of courage meant to humans, and whether it was synonymous with the absence of fear or something that existed alongside it. She did not sensationalize any of it. She expressed no dramatic surprise. She simply listened, noted, and moved to the next question with the quiet precision of someone doing serious work. I found, to my own mild but genuine surprise, that I enjoyed talking to her considerably. She had the quality of asking questions that caused the person answering them to understand their own answers more clearly than they had before the question was asked. Near the end of our time, she said, the Cathari champion sent you a message. It was stated rather than asked. Station communications monitoring was, I knew, not limited to the parties directly involved in the communication. Yes, I said. You replied to him. Yes. May I ask what you told him? I thought about whether there was any reason not to answer her. I told him that I stopped when I did because hurting him was never the purpose, I said. The purpose was to answer a question. Once a question is genuinely answered, anything after that point belongs to a different question, and continuing would be addition without purpose. She considered this. He has not replied yet, I said. She nodded once slowly. He will, she said. with the quiet certainty of someone reading a pattern they have seen play out before in different forms. Species that have never experienced the revision of a core belief have a particular trajectory once it occurs. They either close, they become more rigid, they retreat into the identity they held before the event and work to reinforce its boundaries, or they open. She met my eyes directly. He will open. The message he sent you before any formal response was drafted or any political position was determined. That was already the opening. He was asking a question before he knew what questions were available to him. I did not say anything. You may not fully appreciate, she said, what it means, in the broader political context of this cluster, for a senior member of the Kethari to open in the direction of another species. I am beginning to understand it, I said. It means, she said, that the map may change, not quickly, not without resistance, but change of this kind, once it begins, does not easily stop. The meeting with the Marin Assembly delegate was shorter and more conventionally political. The Marin communicated in long, layered sentences full of conditional clauses and embedded qualifications, and navigating a conversation with them required the kind of patience that only comes from having done it many times. The substance of the meeting was a careful indirect inquiry into whether the human delegation would be willing to extend the summit's agenda by a single additional day to include preliminary discussion of joint exploration rights in the outer sectors. That was entirely Ellison's territory, not mine, and I said so and arranged the connection. The meeting with Previth of the Outer Rim Secondary Council was the shortest of the three and the most direct, and it was the one I found myself returning to most often in the hours afterward. Previth was wide and rust-colored, with a flat face that communicated expression through the mobility of the bony ridge above their eyes rather than through the mouth, and they had a way of sitting that suggested they were always ready to stand quickly if the situation required it. They represented 11 species with observer status at the summit. Species that had been in the Galactic Registry for decades without significant change in their classification or their standing in the broader political structure. Previth sat across from me in a small meeting room and looked at me for a long moment with 4 of their 6 eyes. Then they said, "We want to be reclassified alongside humans." I paused. "I'm sorry?" "In the Galactic Registry," Previth said. "Our current classification is Class C. We want it reviewed, alongside the human review that will be submitted following this summit." A brief pause. "We have held Class C classification for 80 years. What occurred 2 days ago suggests that Class C may designate something different from what the Council has historically assumed it designates." I looked at them carefully. "A reclassification review is a decision for the Council's scientific and assessment bodies," I said. "It is not within my personal authority." "Yes," Previth said, "but it requires someone to put the request forward. It requires a champion. We would like the human delegation to consider filling that role." There was something in the way they said it, not desperate, not political in the calculated way that most requests of this kind were political, but matter-of-fact, as if the reasonableness of the request was self-evident, and the only question was whether someone was willing to say so out loud. "Why now?" I asked. "You said you have held this classification for 80 years. What changed?" Previth's expression shifted. The bony ridge above their eyes moved slightly in what I was beginning to read as the equivalent of a considered pause. "Nothing changed about us," they said. "What changed is that a human demonstrated that Class C does not mean what it has been taken to mean. If it does not mean that for you, it may not mean that for us either." They looked at me steadily. "The classification system is only as accurate as the events it has been able to measure. Before 2 days ago, there were no events to measure. Now there is one." I held that for a moment. "You have been waiting for someone to do something like that," I said. "We have been waiting for someone to do anything," Previth said. "For someone to act rather than accept. The act itself was yours. The principle it demonstrated is not." I told them I would bring the request to Ambassador Ellison, which I did, and she agreed to submit the parallel request alongside the human reclassification submission. It reached the threshold necessary for formal review. Previth sent a short message afterward that said only, "We are grateful." I thought about that message for a long time. Walking back to the delegation quarters after the 3 meetings, I held all of it together and tried to understand what I was looking at. 3 separate encounters, 3 separate species, 3 separate versions of the same underlying thing. The Veth, who studied species and had been studying us for 14 years and had found a missing piece. The Marin, who wanted to build something new. Previth and 11 species who wanted to be seen differently and had been waiting for 80 years for evidence that the seeing could change. None of them had come to talk about what I had done on the floor. They had come because what I had done on the floor had made certain conversations possible that had not been possible before. There is a thing that happens when someone demonstrates that an assumption was wrong. Not just any assumption, but a foundational one. The kind that has been sitting beneath every other thought in a room for so long that nobody remembers choosing it. When that assumption is challenged and the challenge holds, suddenly there is space where there was not space before. People step into that space because they have been looking for it. I had made space. That was not what I had been thinking about when I moved across that floor. I had been thinking about geometry and nerve clusters and tibial joints, but the space was real regardless of what I had been thinking. And the people stepping into it were real, and whatever they were going to build inside it was going to be real too. That evening, my device chimed. I was writing up the day's notes. The message was from Vorak 9. I have been thinking about what you said, addition without purpose. In our tradition, continuation is always purpose. To stop before the conclusion is reached is to concede the conclusion to someone else. You stopped before any conclusion I would have recognized, and yet you clearly reached the end of something. I do not have a word for the kind of ending you chose. I read it twice, then I wrote back. In my language we call it enough. It is not stopping short of the conclusion. It is reaching the actual conclusion and recognizing it clearly when it arrives. The conclusion I was working toward was not your incapacitation. The conclusion was the genuine answer to a real question. Once the question was genuinely answered, continuing past that point would have added nothing to the answer. It would have added something else entirely. Something that was not what the situation required. I sent it and returned to my notes. The chime came again 16 minutes later. I have reviewed the recording of the engagement 14 times, the message said. I understand what occurred. I do not understand the entry angle on the initial point of contact. Your approach from my right at that angle produced an opening in my defensive structure that my analysis indicates should not have existed given the position of my arms at that moment. I have been unable to account for how you identified the opening before it existed. Would you be willing to explain the reasoning? I set my notes aside. I looked at the message for a long time, not at the technical question that I could answer. I was thinking about what the message represented. Vorak 9 had been the unbroken one for an entire career spanning 312 engagements across 14 species. He had never once in all of that time had any reason to ask how someone had found a way through his defense, because no one had ever found one. Every opponent had either yielded before he reached them, or had been resolved before they could attempt any approach. And now he was asking, without resentment, without misdirection, without the protective language that people use when asking a question costs them something they are not sure they want to spend. He was asking because he wanted to understand. And the wanting to understand was clearly stronger than whatever it cost him to be the one asking. There is a specific kind of mind that operates this way. I had encountered it before, in gyms and training rooms, the kind of mind that genuinely prefers accuracy over the comfort of its existing beliefs. It is not common. It is not comfortable to inhabit. It requires a willingness to be regularly and specifically wrong, which is not a thing most beings find easy. But in my experience, it is the most productive kind of mind there is, because a mind that prefers accuracy to comfort keeps improving in the direction of the truth, and a mind that improves in the direction of the truth becomes, over time, very hard to stop. I closed my meeting notes and opened a new document, and I began very carefully to write down exactly what I had done and precisely why, with as much detail as the limited shared vocabulary of two very different beings could carry. The last morning on Pillarven, I woke early. I lay on the station bunk, firm, slightly too short for my frame, designed for a species whose proportions were not mine, and I looked at the ceiling and let myself think through the previous 4 days in order. I did this sometimes, at the end of a difficult posting, not to judge what I had done, just to know what I was carrying when I walked out of the situation and back into ordinary life. What I was carrying was considerably more than I had expected when I arrived. The summit had concluded the previous afternoon with the signing of 17 preliminary agreements, more than twice what the original agenda had projected. The additional day the Marin Assembly had requested had generated enough momentum from 3 other delegations that 4 items stalled for. Months had begun moving again. Ambassador Ellison had managed every element of it with the particular skill she had spent 30 years developing. The ability to hold the shape of a complex negotiation in her mind while adjusting individual elements in real time without losing the larger structure. I had sat beside her and done the work I was there to do. The combination had worked the way good combinations do, each part doing what it was best at, without either diminishing the other. The formal reclassification of humanity in the Galactic Registry had been submitted for review. These things take time. The machinery of interspecies governance is enormous and slow-moving, and tends to catch on procedural details for months at a stretch. But the submission had been made with the support of the Veth Collective and the Outer Rim Secondary Council, which gave it the critical mass required to reach a formal vote, rather than dying quietly in a committee of preliminary review. Dr. Eason had requested a continued research relationship with the human delegation. Ellison had agreed, pending approval from the diplomatic office. I expected the approval to come. I expected a great many things over the coming years to come through that had not previously been seriously considered. The afternoon on the floor had opened a door. What people chose to walk through it was still being decided. The Cathari block had made no further formal complaints after the review session. Councillor Drath had not addressed the human delegation directly after that afternoon's proceedings. Whether that silence was simple anger or something more complicated, I did not yet know. I expected to find out over time. The thing I had been thinking about most consistently over the previous 4 days was not any of those things. It was Vorak 9. We had exchanged 14 messages total over 3 days. The first several had been careful and technical. Him asking precise questions about the engagement, me answering them as accurately as I could, both of us navigating the fact that we had no shared physical vocabulary, that what I was trying to describe was knowledge that lived in my body rather than in my mind, and that translating body knowledge into language loses something essential in the translation. But the conversation had shifted around the 7th message, when I had written something that was not about technique at all. I had written, "The thing I was trying to do on that floor was not defeat you. I want to be clear about that. What I was trying to do was prevent a situation that had been constructed by people who were not you and not me, to end with a human being, publicly diminished in front of 400 observers, as a demonstration of where humans belong in the order of things. I did not blame you for being what you had been sent to be. You did not create the situation. I was responding to the situation, not to you personally." He had been quiet for 2.5 hours after that message. Then he had written, "You knew the difference between me and what was being done with me." I had written back, "Yes." Another long silence. Then, "No one has ever made that distinction before." I had thought about that for a long time. What I eventually wrote back was this: "That distinction may be more significant than anything I did on the floor." Because what I did on the floor was about that afternoon. The distinction is about everything after. His reply came quickly, which felt almost urgent given the long, careful pauses of his earlier messages. "Explain." And so I had tried. I had written for a long time, looking for language that could carry the thought across the distance between two very different kinds of mind. What I sent was something like this: when two beings are placed in a situation designed to produce a particular result, and both of them perform the roles that situation has assigned to them, without questioning those roles, the situation wins, and both participants lose something real. They lose the possibility that the outcome meant anything beyond the mechanics of the setup. The situation was designed for you to stand and for me to fall. If I had fallen, I would have lost what I came to protect. But if I had simply fallen or you had simply won, you would have lost something too. The knowledge that the result carried any real weight, any weight of outcome, a result that was scripted before it began carries no weight. It is a demonstration. Demonstrations inform the audience. They do not inform the participants. I did not want to send a message to an audience the question on that floor was real. It deserved a real answer. And the only way the answer could carry actual weight, for both of us, was if it came from a genuine encounter, not a performance of one. I stopped when I did, because the genuine answer had been given. Continuing past that point would have turned a real answer into a demonstration, and the weight would have left it. There is a word in my language for what separates a genuine contest from a staged one. We call it integrity. I do not know if you have an equivalent concept, he had replied. We have a word. It translates approximately as weight of outcome, a result that carries weight because it was genuinely arrived at. We consider it the highest quality a resolution can achieve. Then, after a pause, I would like to meet with you before you leave. I had agreed. And so, at 7 in the morning on the final day, I went to the cargo area on the lower level of Pillar Ven, where we had arranged to meet. It was a wide space with high ceilings and the low mechanical sound of the station's freight systems behind the walls. Vorak 9 was already there. He stood in the center of the cargo bay in a plain gray garment, nothing ceremonial, nothing armored. Without the formal plating and without the ceremonial hall surrounding him, he looked different. Still enormous. Still physically extraordinary, but without the performance of the setting, the scale of him was simply what it was. The way a large rock in an open field is simply a large rock and not a symbol of anything. Present. Real, no longer performing. He looked at me when I came in. I walked to him and stopped about 8 feet away. "You are not afraid of me," he said. "No," I said. "You were not afraid on the floor either," he said. "I have been considering that. Most beings produce a measurable fear response when in my proximity. Your physiology produced something different. What did it produce?" I asked. He considered how to render it in terms the translation could carry. "Calculation," he said. "Active assessment. You were measuring." "Yes," I said. "That is what I do not have a framework for," he said. "Every being I have faced began from fear. They were either controlled by it, or they were fighting against it. The relationship with the fear was always the central thing. You appeared not to have that relationship. The fear was there," I said. "It is always there. But I was trained to let it exist in the same space as other things. Information, recognition of pattern, the memory of what I have done in situations like this one. The fear does not go away. It just stops being the only thing available." He stood quietly for a moment. "I have never felt fear," he said. "Not in 312 engagements, not once." A pause. "I have been thinking about whether that has been an advantage." "What have you concluded?" I asked. "That it has not," he said. "Not entirely. Fear would have required me to prepare for the possibility of a different outcome. I did not prepare for a different outcome because I did not believe one was possible. The absence of fear was the absence of preparation for the thing that actually occurred." He looked at me steadily. "You prepared for me. I did not prepare for you. That is not a question of size or strength. It is a question of what we each believed was within the range of possibility." "Yes," I said, "that is exactly right." He was quiet again then. "Will you show me?" "Now," I said. "You described the entry angle in your message last night," he said. "I read it many times. I understand it as language. I do not understand it as movement. The gap between those two forms of understanding is very large." It was a very large gap, and he had named it precisely and without any pretense, and my respect for him increased considerably in that moment. "I can show you the principle," I said, "not the specific application I used on the floor. That was particular to your anatomy and the geometry of that room. The underlying principle, yes, I can show you that." "That is what I want," he said. We spent an hour in that cargo bay, with the freight systems humming in the walls and a narrow bar of light coming through a high window. I showed him the principle of entering a moment before the moment officially begins. He was an extraordinary student. He moved with care and without ego, which made complete sense when I thought about it. He had just discovered a gap in his understanding that mattered to him deeply, and he was giving the process of closing it his full undivided attention. He asked sharp, practical questions. He corrected himself immediately when I indicated something was not right. He had the quality that makes great students in any discipline, a genuine willingness to be at the beginning, even when they have spent an entire life at the end of something else. After about 40 minutes, he stopped and stood still and looked at me. "I have a question," he said, unrelated to the technique. "Ask it," I said. "When you wrote that you were responding to the situation and not to me personally," he said, "you meant that you held no hostility toward me." "Yes. But you also meant something more than that," he said. "You meant that you saw me as separate from the purpose I was being used for." "Yes," I said. "Most beings would not have made that distinction," he said. "Most beings would have experienced the situation and the instrument of the situation as the same thing." "I know," I said. "Why did you not?" I thought about it carefully. "Because the distinction mattered for what came after," I said. "If I had seen you as simply the situation, the threat that needed to be handled, then the handling of it was all there was, and whatever came after would be built on top of that. And I did not want what came after to be built on that. It is very difficult to build something real on top of humiliation. Something made on top of humiliation is fragile, because the foundation is not the right shape. Whatever comes next between our species, whatever needs to be built, needs to rest on something different." He stood very still for a long moment. "What does it need to rest on?" he asked. "Something closer to what we are doing right now," I said. He looked at me, and then something changed in him that I cannot describe with full precision. A slight lowering of his upper arms, a shift in the angle of his head, something in the amber eyes that I recognized as one mind acknowledging another. Not capitulation, not performance, just the simple, unelaborated acknowledgement that one intelligent being gives another when the performance is over and the actual contact begins. We stood in the cargo bay for a moment in the hum of the station. "The next time there is a summit," he said. "Yes?" I said. "I will know who Nathan Cole is," he said. I will know who you are too, I said. He nodded once, then he turned and walked toward the far door. I stood and watched him go. When the door closed, I stood in the hum of the freight systems and the pale bar of light from the high window and let myself feel the tiredness that I had been managing for 4 days without acknowledging. Not the tiredness that comes from the fight itself. The deeper tiredness that comes from sustained, complete attention. From 4 days of being entirely present in every room, every conversation, every exchange, and only now in a cargo bay with no one else in it, being permitted to let the attention rest. I stood there and felt it. Then I went back to help Ambassador Ellison prepare the final report. The transport ship departed Pillar Ven at 1400 hours. It was a standard Earth vessel, and the familiar sounds and the familiar quality of the air were, I found, more of a relief than I had expected. I had a small cabin to myself. I sat on the bunk and watched the station shrink through the porthole and disappear into the dark. Ellison came to the door about 20 minutes after departure. She came in and sat in the single chair by the small desk. "The report is filed," she said. "How did you frame it?" I asked. "Accurately," she said. "Summit concluded with strong results. Minor incident during resolution proceedings managed appropriately by security staff. No lasting diplomatic consequence." She paused. I noted that the incident may have contributed to the favorable shift in the summit's final outcomes. "May have," I said. "The diplomatic office prefers may have," she said. "It gives them space to interpret events at their own pace." She was quiet for a moment. The stars through the porthole were very clear. 17 agreements, she said. 2 reclassification submissions. 3 new bilateral frameworks with species we had no frameworks with before. 1 ongoing research partnership with the Veth Collective. She pulled out her device. And 1 message from Vorak 9 to the human delegation this morning. The first formal individual correspondence from a Cathari resolution specialist to any non-Cathari delegation in the recorded history of the Council. "What did it say?" I asked. She read from the device. "It has been my practice to consider engagements concluded upon their completion. I find that this engagement is not concluded. I would consider it appropriate for this correspondence to be forwarded to whoever in the human governance structure is responsible for decisions about continued interspecies dialogue. The conversation has begun. It should continue." She set the device on her knee. "He is asking for an ongoing channel," I said. "He is asking for an ongoing channel," she confirmed. "Not through official Cathari diplomatic structures. Directly." I looked out the porthole. The stars were moving their slow, nearly imperceptible fraction as the transport adjusted course. "It should continue," I said. "Yes, Ellison said it should." She stood. "Get some rest, Nathan. You have earned it." She went to the door. Then she stopped and looked back. "Whatever that Class C classification gets changed to," she said, "the new entry should mention you by name." "I was doing my job," I said. "Yes," she said. "You were doing your job. And doing your job changed something that has not changed in 3 centuries. A pause. "That is worth noting." She closed the door. I lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling. I thought about a boxing club on the east side of Carlisle. I thought about a cargo bay on a space station, and a being 11 feet tall who had asked to be taught. I thought about 400 observers in a ceremonial hall, and the particular quality of the silence that falls when a room full of intelligent beings all revise the same assumption at the same moment. I thought about 5 strikes in less than 2 seconds. I thought about what they had opened, and how long the opening would last, and what would be built inside it. I thought about Eason and her careful questions, and Previth and 11 species asking to be seen differently, and Ellison and 17 agreements on the strength of a summit that was supposed to have been ordinary. I thought about the word enough, and the phrase weight of outcome, and the difference between answering a real question and performing an answer for an audience. And then I thought it's about something smaller and simpler. I thought about the moment just before I moved. The 12 feet of empty floor, the amber eyes, the drawing of breath, the opening of 4 arms. I thought about what it felt like to stand in that moment and make the decision without waiting for permission. Everyone else in that hall had been waiting for someone else to decide what came next. I had decided. That was the whole of it, stripped down to its bones, not the training, though the training was what made it possible. Not the preparation, though the preparation was what made it effective. Those things mattered enormously. They were the foundation that the moment rested on, but the moment itself was something smaller and more fundamental than any of it. I had decided not to wait. Outside the porthole, the stars continued their slow, indifferent movement. Pillar Ven was already too far away to see. I closed my eyes, and I slept.